Europe, 20,000 years ago. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are 4 years old. You don't know what cold means yet, not the cold of an air-conditioned room, not the cold of a winter morning. You know the cold that kills. The cold that turns breath into white smoke before it even leaves your lips. The cold that makes your fingers stop feeling before your mind realizes they are gone. Outside, the wind comes off the glaciers with a force that doesn't push, it cuts, like obsidian. Like something that has a will of its own, and that will is not friendly to human beings. The temperature has been 30 degrees below zero for 11 days without stopping. You are small. You are inside a cave that smells of wet stone and burnt fat and something older, the fear of every person who slept in this same darkness before you were born. The fire is behind you. Ahead of you, just a few steps away, is the mouth of the cave, the threshold where the darkness inside meets the storm outside. And your mother is doing something strange. She is taking ash from the fire gray, still faintly warm, and spreading it slowly, deliberately, across the floor of that threshold. Not inside, not outside. Exactly at the line between the two worlds. She has done this every single day of your life. Her mother did it. Her mother's mother did it. For 70,000 years before this moment, human beings at the entrance of caves across 3 continents had performed this same quiet act with the same quiet precision. For a century, the scientists who found the evidence of this practice looked at it and said the same thing. Ritual, superstition, primitive magical thinking, a symbolic border between the living and the dead. Evidence of spiritual belief fascinating, but ultimately, the behavior of minds not yet fully formed. It was a comfortable conclusion. It fit the story we told ourselves about who our ancestors were, beings impressive enough to survive, but not quite intelligent enough to engineer their survival. They were wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in the margins. Fundamentally, embarrassingly, completely wrong. What those ashes were actually doing at the threshold of every cave, in Israel, in South Africa, in France, in China, what they had been silently doing for tens of thousands of years, was not magic. It was science, calculated, precise, multifunctional, so effective that no one found a reason to change it for 70 millennia. And when researchers finally understood what they were looking at, some of them sat in silence for a long time. Because the question was no longer, were our ancestors intelligent? The question became something far more unsettling. What are we looking at right now in our own time and calling superstition that our descendants will one day recognize as genius? Hold that question. We're going to come back to it. The first scientist who suspected something was wrong with the ritual explanation was not looking for a revolution. She was looking at dirt. Specifically, she was looking at layers of ash deposits at the entrance of Kafse Cave near Nazareth, in the Lower Galilee region of Israel, excavated systematically from the 1960s through the 1990s by teams led by Bernard van der Meersch of the University of Bordeaux and Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard University. And what she saw in those layers didn't fit the story that had been told for 100 years. Ritual behavior leaves traces of variability. It changes with leaders, it shifts with culture. It evolves, disappears, reappears in different forms across different eras and different groups. These ash deposits did none of that. Layer after layer, separated by thousands of years of geological time, the pattern was identical. Always at the threshold. Always the same width, always the same chemical composition, always between 40 and 80 centimeters thick. The isotopic analyses confirmed what the eyes already suspected: these ashes had not spilled from interior fires by accident. They had been carried to the threshold deliberately, from hearths deeper inside the cave, and placed there with intention. Someone was making decisions. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. But it was Pinnacle Point Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, excavated by Professor Curtis Marion and his team at Arizona State University's Institute of Human Origins between 1999 and 2018. That made the scientific community fall silent for the first time. Because Pinnacle Point didn't show a pattern across thousands of years. It showed a pattern across 70,000 years, uninterrupted, unaltered. 70,000 years of the same practice, in the same location, with the same precision. Professor Marion stated that the consistency of these deposits was statistically incompatible with random or purely ritual behavior. Think about what 70,000 years means. The entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire, every war, every invention, every written word, fits inside the last 5,000 years. These ash deposits at the threshold had been maintained for 14 times that length of time, without a single generation deciding to stop. Then came the finding that changed everything. The Arcy-sur-Cure cave system in Yonne, Burgundy, France, studied extensively by France's National Center for Scientific Research, revealed that Neanderthals had left ash deposits at cave thresholds between 50 and 70,000 years ago. Evidence from those Neanderthal occupation layers suggests the same deliberate relationship with ash at the threshold long before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. This was not a human invention. This was older than our species in Europe, more widespread than any single culture, more universal than any shared tradition. And at Blombos Cave in South Africa, among the sites investigated by the University of Bergen since 1991, led by Professor Christopher Henshelwood, phytolith and micro-charcoal analyses revealed something that made the ritual explanation finally completely collapse. The materials burned to produce the threshold ash were different from the materials burned in the interior hearths. Someone was selecting specific woods, specific bones, producing a specific type of ash deliberately, consistently, across generations for reasons that had nothing to do with ceremony. One archaeologist who reviewed the Blombos data reportedly closed his notebook, looked at the ceiling, and said nothing for 3 minutes. Because the only question left was not whether this was intentional. The only question was, what were they building? What the researchers found when they finally stopped treating the ash as a cultural artifact and started treating it as a material with physical and chemical properties was not one answer. It was four. Four simultaneous, overlapping, mutually reinforcing functions that together form something modern engineering has a specific name for: a passive, multi-system defense. No moving parts, no maintenance. No fuel required after the initial deposit, just ash, in the right place. The first function was biological. Wood ash carries a pH level between 11 and 12 on the standard scale. To put that in context, household bleach sits at around pH 12 to 13. Ash is not far behind. At that level of alkalinity, the chemistry becomes lethal to arthropods. It destroys helminth eggs, the intestinal parasites that were, in the Ice Age, one of the leading causes of chronic illness and death in cave-dwelling human groups. It dehydrates flea larvae before they can hatch. It creates a chemical barrier that lice and mites cannot cross without dying. Paleoparasitological analyses of Ice Age cave sediments have documented massive concentrations of helminth eggs in interior occupation layers, and a statistically significant reduction precisely in the threshold zones where ash had been deposited. The threshold was not a spiritual border. It was a decontamination zone, a sterile boundary between the parasite-rich world outside and the sleeping bodies inside. In a world without medicine, without germ theory, without any understanding of what a parasite even was, these people had built a barrier that worked. The second function was thermal. Ash has one of the lowest thermal conductivity ratings of any naturally occurring material, approximately 0.1 watts per meter Kelvin, compared to soil at 0.5 to 2 watts per meter Kelvin. Its microscopic structure, millions of tiny air pockets formed during combustion, makes it an extraordinary insulator. A layer of ash across the threshold significantly reduces ground-level heat loss to the exterior. But the more critical effect was aerodynamic. At the entrance of a cave, cold air from outside doesn't fall, it skims. It travels along the floor in a thin, dense layer, sliding inward like an invisible river. An ash barrier across the threshold interrupts that flow. It forces the cold air to rise before it enters, mixing it with the warmer air above and meaningfully reducing the temperature experienced by anyone sleeping near the entrance. Those positions near the entrance were typically occupied by the people responsible for night watch, the ones who needed to stay alert, the ones whose survival directly determined the survival of everyone else inside. 2 degrees of difference in body temperature sounds like a footnote. At 30 below zero, 2 degrees is not a footnote. 2 degrees is the difference between waking up and never waking up at all. The third function was predatory deterrence. The great carnivores of the Ice Age, cave lions, giant hyenas, cave bears, possessed olfactory systems vastly superior to the human sense of smell. Cave bears in particular are estimated to have been hundreds of times more olfactorily sensitive than modern humans. Their large nasal cavities adapted for detecting scent across vast frozen distances, For them, scent was not a sense, it was a world. Analyses of organic residues preserved in ash deposits at Vogelherd Cave in the Lone Valley of Baden-Württemberg, Germany, studied extensively by the University of Tübingen, revealed the consistent presence of coniferous resins and terpenic compounds in concentrations that far exceeded what any normal interior campfire would have produced. This was not accidental. The materials selected for threshold burning were specifically, deliberately chosen for their repellent chemical properties. Juniper, pine, resins that, when reduced to ash, continued releasing volatile organic compounds for days after the initial burning. Picture this moment. It is the middle of the night. The fire inside is burned low. The cave entrance is dark. And somewhere in the blackness outside, a cave bear 500 kilograms of muscle and hunger is moving through the tundra, following the scent trail of the humans inside. It reaches the threshold. It stops. Something in the chemistry of that gray dust triggers an ancient alarm in its nervous system. Not pain, not fear exactly. Something older, a signal that says, this place is wrong, move on. The ash was a silent guardian that never slept, never tired, and never needed to be told to stand watch. The fourth function was social and communicative. Ash is not one color. Bone ash is white. Wood ash is gray. Charcoal is black. Mixed deposits produce gradients and patterns that, to eyes trained from birth to read them, carry information. The distribution and composition of threshold deposits could indicate how long a cave had been occupied, the approximate size of the group inside, whether the occupants were present or had moved on, whether the site was safe for allied groups passing through. It was a passive, zero-cost, weather-resistant information system with a lifespan measured in weeks. Consistent with Robin Dunbar's broader argument that social information management was a primary driver of early human cognitive development, these ash patterns were not decorative, they were data. And this fourth function is the one that most quietly astonishes me, because we look at our screens, at our notifications, at the infinite flow of signals we send each other across invisible networks, and we call it modern. But 70,000 years ago, at the mouth of a cave in South Africa, someone was already transmitting, already encoding, already building a system to tell the world, we are here, we are many, and we are prepared. The medium was ash. The message was survival. At this point, a skeptic might reasonably ask, could this be coincidence? Could independent cave-dwelling cultures, separated by geography and time, have simply stumbled onto similar-looking practices for completely unrelated reasons? It is a fair question. The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no, so definitively, so completely, is what makes this story not just about ash. It makes this story about the nature of human intelligence itself. The evidence from China arrived first. The Zhukudian Cave Complex, located approximately 42 kilometers southwest of Beijing, has been studied exhaustively by the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences since systematic excavations began in 1921. What the sediment layers revealed was staggering in its implications. Ash deposits at the cave entrances with compositional characteristics nearly identical to those found at African and European sites, dated to approximately 400,000 to 780,000 years ago, based on uranium series dating and paleomagnetic studies. Not Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, a species that diverged from our direct ancestral line more than 1 million years ago, was practicing the same threshold ash deposition with the same material selectivity on the other side of the planet. This was no longer a cultural tradition. This was a discovery, made independently, multiple times, across hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary separation. Then came Australia. Aboriginal groups who maintained Paleolithic adjacent lifestyles into historically documented times, studied by researchers at the Australian National University through extensive ethnographic fieldwork, practiced systematic ash deposition at the entrances of rock shelters as a living tradition. But what the ethnographic records revealed was more remarkable than the practice itself. These groups had names for different types of ash, specific vocabulary for specific compositions with specific properties and specific uses at the threshold. A taxonomy of ash, a body of knowledge so detailed, so refined, so carefully transmitted across generations that it had survived intact into the modern era, not as ritual, not as habit, but as applied knowledge that practitioners could explain and justify functionally. The knowledge had not been lost. It had been maintained because it remained necessary. In North America, the pattern completed itself. Indigenous groups of the subarctic regions, documented by anthropologists from the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, maintained practices at the entrances of their winter shelters that were, in their functional logic, almost identical to what had been documented on 3 other continents across hundreds of thousands of years. No contact, no shared ancestry at the level of this specific practice. No common cultural transmission. The same problem, the same solution. When that happens, when minds that have never met arrive at the same precise answer to the same precise question, there is a word for it in evolutionary biology: convergence. And convergence does not happen by accident. It happens because reality has a shape, because physics and chemistry do not change according to latitude or century, because some solutions are not inventions, they are discoveries, waiting to be found by any intelligence patient enough and observant enough to find them. These people were patient. These people were observant. These people were, in every meaningful sense of the word, scientists. The modern confirmation came through experiment. Experimental archaeology projects replicating Upper Paleolithic shelter conditions, including work informed by researchers at institutions such as the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the University of Exeter, have tested these practices under controlled conditions, approximating Ice Age environments. The groups that used ash barriers at their shelter thresholds, following the patterns documented, archaeologically experienced results that were, even to the researchers who designed the experiments, striking in their clarity. A significant, measurable reduction in the incidence of intestinal parasitic infections compared to control groups in some controlled trials, exceeding 70%. A measurable difference in average body temperature during sleep hours at threshold positions, small in modern terms, but physiologically critical under Ice Age conditions, where the margin between survival and hypothermia was razor thin. A documented reduction in nighttime intrusions by wild animals into the camp perimeter. Findings from experimental work of this kind have been documented across multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Archaeological Science, contributing to what researchers have described as a substantial revision of standard models of Paleolithic cognition. The response from the broader scientific community was not controversy. It was something rarer and more telling than controversy. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when evidence arrives that cannot be argued with, only absorbed. When a field realizes, collectively and without fanfare, that it has been looking at genius and calling it something lesser for a very long time, the ash worked. It had always worked. We were simply the last ones to understand why. Do you remember the child at the beginning, 4 years old, standing at the threshold of a cave in Ice Age Europe, watching her mother spread warm ash across the cold stone floor with quiet, practiced hands? She didn't know the word pH. She didn't know what a helminth egg was. She had never heard of thermal conductivity or terpenic compounds or passive multi-system defense. But she was watching, she was learning. And one day when she had children of her own, when the glacier wind came cutting through the dark again, she would kneel at the threshold of her own cave and do exactly what her mother had done. Not because she was told to believe in it, because she had seen it work. There is a particular kind of arrogance that civilizations develop when they become comfortable. We look backward at people who live without our tools, without our vocabulary, without our institutions, and we see limitation. We see absence. We see minds that hadn't yet arrived at what we consider normal. We called them primitive. We called their knowledge superstition. We spent 100 years excavating the evidence of their genius and filing it under the category of ritual because we were not yet intelligent enough to recognize what we were looking at. Let that sit for a moment. We were not intelligent enough. The humans of the Ice Age did not have laboratories. They did not have peer review. They did not have the Journal of Archaeological Science. What they had was something we are quietly, dangerously losing. Time to observe, patience to remember, humility to learn from failure. They watched the world with a precision that most of us will never achieve. They understood the properties of materials not through instruments but through generations of careful attention. They built solutions so elegant, so complete, so perfectly matched to the problem that those solutions survived unchanged for 70,000 years. When a modern engineer designs a system that simultaneously solves four distinct problems with zero moving parts and zero ongoing cost, we give them awards. When the people of the Ice Age did exactly that with ash, we called it magic. There is one more thing worth saying. The ash did not remember their names. No monument carries them. No written record preserves their faces or their words or the specific moment, one of them, cold, tired, watching the storm outside first. Notice that the threshold with ash stayed warmer, stayed cleaner, stayed safer than the threshold without it. History forgot them completely. But the ash remembered their wisdom. It held it in its alkaline chemistry, in its thermal structure, in its volatile organic compounds. Patient, silent, and perfectly functional, across a darkness of 70,000 years. Waiting for us to finally be quiet enough to listen. The next time you see ash gray and fine and apparently worthless at the edge of a fire, remember what it once meant. Remember that somewhere in your lineage, in a cave you will never find, on a night colder than anything you have ever felt, a person who loved their children exactly as much as you love yours made a decision with that ash. And because of that decision, you are here.